want to see the people, I'm going to you're just going to see me for now, just because it's a little distracting. Then you're going to just see my PowerPoint.
Oh, okay.
It's all about me. It's all about me. All right. You just.
Yeah, that's fine.
All right, everybody. Hi. Welcome. I'm Regina Feeney. I'm the librarian and archivist at the Freeport Memorial Library. Thank you for attending this lecture. Regina reads the phone book. Full disclosure, I will not be reading the phone book. Yes, I know it's false advertising, but I got you to come, so my bait and switch worked. What I will be discussing is the amazing information found in our local historical directories and phone books. I will also present the history of telephone service in Freeport, and this will include Freeport's love of the telephones, but its hatred of telephone poles. This is my 8th local history lecture during this time of COVID, and I hope everyone is doing well and is safe. COVID has presented us with many challenges, but has shown us how resourceful we can be. I am very proud of library workers. During COVID, we were able to pivot very quickly to an online environment, almost seamlessly. We went from providing access to physical materials to downloadable books and magazines, as well as provide free access to streaming services. While our building was closed for 3 months, we still offered the community reference services and programming, albeit from our kitchen, tables, and basements. Like the telephone, technologies like Zoom and GoToMeeting have expanded our connections with others. No longer are people tied to their zip codes. However, this has presented unique opportunities and challenges for library programming. Our programming can reach people outside the boundaries of our community. However, this means that we have a lot of competition. It is a constant struggle to come up with creative programs that will be of interest to the public. Another challenge is that we have been told that we have to do these programs while we're in the library. That means access for patrons, remote access for patrons, but not for library presenters like me. So I have to take into consideration my schedule when booking a date and time for a program. And I have to admit, this has left me frustrated at times. And one day while working the reference desk, my colleagues and I were bouncing programming ideas around. And I exclaimed in frustration, how about I just read the phone book? And almost instantly, I realized this could be a really good idea for a program. So here we are. So just a couple of housekeeping things. If we were doing this in person, I'd probably give you a speech now about turning your cell phones off and where the bathrooms are. But now I'm just going to tell you, just please make sure your mics on your computers are muted. And if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat box, and we'll do questions and answers at the end of the program. Okay. Also on this program, I just want to give you some background information. In 2003, the Freeport Memorial Library partnered with the Freeport Historical Society on a digitization initiative. The goal of this project is to get as much of Freeport history scanned and accessible online as possible. This includes newspapers, photographs, newsletters, yearbooks, and directories and phone books. So I wanted to take a moment to show you how you can access these directories and phone books that have been digitized. Hold on one second. I'm going to close this and share my screen. Hold on. Okay. Okay, here we are. Okay. All right, so if you guys go to freeportlibrary.info, that will take you right to our webpage. And if you go along the top to e-resources, go to info guides. Click on that. And it will open a list of guides. And if you go to the local history resources tab there, you will get to the local history resources LibGuide. And there's a picture of me. And this tab here, directory information, business and residential, if you click on that, these are all the digitized versions of
COVID-19 library features.
Of course, now we have the announcement.
To an hour, and masks must be worn properly at all times. Thank you.
Okay, so here are the list of our digitized directories, and they are in date order. So the oldest being 1878 to 1879. And we're going to go through these in the PowerPoint presentation. One of the more interesting directories that I'm not talking about in this presentation, but I want to point it out to you, is the 1919 Methodist Church directory right here. This is a directory of members of the Freeport Methodist Church. And what I love about this directory, it actually lists women by their first names, which is unusual because most people women are listed by their husband's name, so Mrs. Tom Smith. So it's actually a really good source for genealogy if you're looking for a woman with a unique first name. Down here, we keep going. We have a 1926-1927 Polk business directory. This is from Ancestry.com, and a lot of people don't realize that Ancestry does have a lot of these old directories and phone books online. Unfortunately, they can be very hard to use, especially if you wanted to like go through the whole directory. It's easy to look at if you're looking for one person, but if you wanted to look at it in its entirety, and don't even try to print it off because if you do, the font is so small you can't even see it. And another interesting directory that we have is this there is the 1934 and 1935 high school yearbooks actually include a directory section in them. And so what we did was we transcribed them. So all the juniors and seniors are listed alphabetically with their address. So that is also a very, very useful tool. And it's just limited to obviously those that were in Freeport High School. And if you are looking for directories outside Freeport for both Nassau and Suffolk counties, you can check out Great Neck Public Library. They do have a collection of both Nassau and Suffolk County phone books. They are on microfiche, but you do need to call and make an appointment, and you can find that information right here. Okay, so that's that. Now I'm going to start with my program. Okay. Okay. Okay, so one of the things you're going to notice about the directories that we include in this presentation is that many of them predate the phone, at least the phone in Freeport. And that's because most of these ended up just being residential directories. One of the first phones on Long Island was reported to be in 1877, and that was the phone of John L. Haight. He was working on the Brooklyn Bridge, and he had an office in Manhattan, and his factory was in Brooklyn, and the wires were run over the Brooklyn Bridge as it was being constructed. So he could tell the factory what was going on because the factory was actually producing the steel cables for the Brooklyn Bridge. The first known telephone in Nassau County is believed to be from 1881, and that was a resident of Glen Cove who had to pay to have all of the poles put up so he could get telephone access. The South Shore Telephone Company was organized in 1897. Its switchboard was located in the tailor shop of Charles Schneider, and that is somewhere in the area of Main Street and Church Street. The South Shore Telephone Company paid him about $100 a year to use his business for their switchboard, and that covered the cost of his rent. And to have telephone service at that time cost $15 a year, which in today's money was about $470. By 1898, the South Shore Telephone Company had about 200 connections. In 1899, the New York and New Jersey Telephone Company begins placing poles in Freeport, and they operated out of Charles A.V.'s drugstore that was located at 31 West Merrick Road. Early on, there was 9 major exchanges in Nassau County, and they included Glen Cove, Hempstead, Port Washington, Great Neck, Oyster Bay, Rockville Center, Freeport, and East Rockaway. By 1900, there were 15 telephone subscribers in Freeport. In 1925, a 3-story telephone building was constructed at 120 South Grove Street, which is now Guy Lombardo Avenue. The foundation that was laid was reported to be able to bear the load of a 6-story building. And because the telephone company expected to be able to expand. That building opened in 1926 and was 3 stories. And at some point in the future, a 4th story was added, and so was an extension. In 1930, the New York Telephone Company constructed a 10-story building in the village of Hempstead. And it was the tallest building constructed in that village. In 1947, there was a telephone strike that lasted 5 weeks. And there are a lot of photos in the newspaper of the telephone strike in front of the telephone building in Freeport, people on picket lines. And it was mostly the switchboard operators because they were protesting low pay and long hours. That telephone building is still there. It is right across the street from the Malibu Hotel. In 1952, dial service began for the exchanges of Freeport 8, Freeport 9, and Baldwin 3. And if you're not familiar with those exchanges, they correspond to the numbers 378, 379, and 223. Dial service meant that local calls could be made without operator assistance. In 1953, Mayor Doxey was the first Freeporter to make what was called a direct dial toll call, which is a fancy way of saying he made a long distance call. And for the record, he called New Jersey. And yes, back in the day, people did pay for long distance. And in 1974, another telephone building was constructed on Russell Place in Freeport. Here's an ad for the South Shore Telephone Company. It was organized in 1897 with capital of $2,000. And you can see at the bottom, these are all Freeporters, Bergen, Miller, Libby. They were all Freeporters. And I also believe John J. Randall was involved in this too. By October, the company had 40 connections in Freeport, 30 in Rockville Center, and 15 in Baldwin. In 1903, the telephone company ran lines from Manhattan to Montauk. And in 1906, the South Shore Telephone Company merged with its rival, the New York and New Jersey Telephone Company. This is a photograph of the New York Telephone Company, and this was their commercial offices located up the block from their telephone building at 26 South Grove Street. In 1925, the Daily Review did what I'm doing right now. They kind of looked at old telephone records in Freeport and wrote an article about it. And some of the things that they found out that in 1914, there were 2 exchanges that covered this area. That was Freeport and Montauk. And the total subscribers were 1,742. And the area that they covered was Baldwin, Belmore, Freeport, Merrick, Roosevelt, Seaford, and Montauk. The Montauk Exchange was the branch for Freeport, and it employed 3 operators. It was reported that more people in the Freeport area were served by the telephone company than any other place on Long Island outside of New York City. In 1953, there were 32,000 telephones for the exchanges of Freeport 8, Freeport 9, Mayfair 3, and Baldwin 3, which is 378, 379, 623, and 223. Freeport 9 became available in 1950, and Mayfair 3 started in 1953. And the 623 number, which is the Mayfair 3, served Freeport, Roosevelt, Merrick, and North Merrick. People often say to me, I would love to go back in time and live in Freeport because things were simpler then. Let me just say this. Nothing in Freeport is ever simple. It never is now, it never has been, and never will be. It's just a different crazy at a different time. And early on, utility poles just set everyone off. They were a problem the minute they got erected. In 1898, the village board had 3 laborers from the New York, New Jersey Telephone Company arrested for erecting poles without a permit. And this is because the village was like, we have all these telephone companies, we have an electric company, and we have companies like Western Union, right? So there's telephones, there's electric, there's teletypes, there are the ticker tape machines, right? All of those require wires, and every organization cannot be putting up their own poles. So if you're going to put up a pole, you have to agree that everyone can use the same poles. And I guess the New York, New Jersey Telephone Company did not agree to that. And the minute they put up their own poles, they got arrested. And I think they all had to pay like a $5 fine. In 1900, there were complaints about the wires on Main Street because there was too many poles. So the village made it so that there could only be a maximum of 10 poles on South Main Street. In 1903, it was a banner year for pole craziness. And this was not just in Freeport, it was all throughout Long Island. And you can see here, according to these articles, people would get so mad at the poles being put up, they would literally jump that were dug for the poles. There is a story there for the New York Tribune, and Mrs. Patterson is actually falsely identified as being a Freeporter. She's from Belmore. She was so angry when the workers showed up to put these utility poles in. She brought a gun, a dog, and an axe, and she herself ultimately jumped in the hole to stop the erecting of the poles. In the same year, 1903, Louis Vogel, who had a huge house on Merrick Road and Bayview Avenue, where the Meadowbrook Care Facility is today, it was a huge house with these huge gables and a porte cochere. He comes home and there's a utility pole in the middle of his driveway. And he has to go over down to Village Hall and tell the village, you need to remove that because I can't drive my car in my driveway. This actually made the village minutes. In 1911, there's talk about putting the wires underground, and everyone thought that was a great idea until they started to do it, and they realized this is really hard and really expensive because every time now you want to change something or add something, you have to rip the street and the sidewalks up. So basically the poles remained. Oh, and the other thing about telephone poles, Freeport gets cars about 1900. That's when the first cars start coming to Freeport. And almost instantaneously, people are wrapping their cars around the telephone poles. They're just a magnet for cars. There's like no cars, but if you're going to have an accident, it's going to be with a telephone pole. Okay, this is a glass negative of Freeport. This is taken from the driveway of the Crystal Lake Hotel. So that is Southside Avenue and looking towards Guy Lombardo Avenue. So today you would be standing on the property of the Gennard House looking into the parking lot of 7-Eleven. Towards the right, you're going to see there's two houses, and one house has a very distinct onion dome. Those two houses are still there. They're across the street from Randall Park. And in the background, you see the telephone poles. And this is a bit of an issue because they're not straight like we know telephone poles to be today. They were kind of gnarly and kind of crooked. And when I said that this was a problem throughout Long Island, there's stories of like people in the Hamptons axing down these poles because they were so ugly looking. This is photos of some early phones in Freeport. So the first one is a candlestick telephone. So you can see the gentleman is talking into the mouthpiece and he's got the earpiece up, holding it into his ear. The next photograph is the actual switchboard from Village Hall. The next photograph is a Kellogg telephone, originally from located at 350 South Main Street, which is the home of the Freeport Historical Society. This was the original phone for Dr. and Mrs. Evans. And you notice there's a little crank on the side. That's how you use the telephone. You cranked it to get the battery going. And in that same picture to the right of it, that is my original cell phone, which is about the size of a brick. And next, the final picture is that of a payphone, a rotary payphone, and it is a Mayfair 3 number. Okay, so for those of you not familiar with Freeport, Freeport is one of 3 communities on Long Island that produce produces its own electric. And in June of 1922, there was a power surge at the Freeport Electric Department. And this caused random telephones to catch on fire. So luckily for the homeowners, because this was in the middle of the night, the power surge also caused their phones to ring. And you all know, like in the middle of the night, your phone rings. You obviously jump up because obviously something bad's happening. And you run to get your telephone and you realize your telephone is now on fire. So what do? Like, who do you call when your phone's on fire? So people are ripping them off the walls, they're cutting the wires, they're jumping into their cars, trying to drive and get help. People are running around in their pajamas. So the village is alerted to this fact. They cut the power to the village. In fact, the switchboard at Village Hall starts to arc and smoke. The switchboard at the phone company starts to arc and smoke too. It was just craziness. We're just lucky nobody got hurt, and not a lot of damage was reported. In fact, the newspaper had fun with this, and they referred to the sparking and smoking telephones as a pyrotechnical display. All right, so let's get into the main event here. Let's talk about our directories and telephone books. So the earliest phone book that we know of that covers Freeport is the Lain's Directory of Long Island from 1878 to 1879. So this is a straight directory. It actually isn't, I shouldn't call it a phone book because it doesn't include phone numbers. I got this from Internet Archives, and so you can see it covers a lot of communities. So what I did was, since it's free of copyright, I just downloaded it and I just posted on that page I showed you just the Freeport pages. And the company that published it was Lain and Company. They were a Brooklyn publisher that began publishing directories of Brooklyn in 1857. And they used canvassers who were hired because they could write in a good hand and possessed an average degree of common sense. So in this directory, we see George W. Bergen, who was involved with the South Shore Telephone Company. Mr. Bergen was born in 1814. He was born in Brooklyn, and he began his career as a grocery clerk in 1830 with the firm of Thomas Carman. He worked at a number of grocery firms in Brooklyn before joining Carman, Valentine, and Company. He took the company over by buying out Thomas Carman's interest in the firm in 1838. And he renamed the firm Valentine, Bergen, and Company. Bergen's wife, Susan, was the daughter of Thomas Carman. And the couple and their family moved to Freeport permanently in 1872. Bergen built this house in 1869. It was located on Fulton Avenue, which is now Merrick Road, and it is where Elks Plaza is today. It featured a 50-foot high tower with many wings and extensions. On the north side was a beautiful flower garden. On the west, a greenhouse, and a replica of the house as a birdhouse. Behind the house were barns, a carriage house, a root cellar, a poultry house, a workshop, an ice house, and stables. A small farm supplied fresh vegetables for the family. On the north side of the house, there was a beautiful 5-acre park of grass and trees, which stretched from Fulton Avenue, now Merrick Road, to the railroad tracks and was bounded by Long Beach Avenue, Bergen Place, and Pine Street. So if you're not that familiar with George Bergen, you probably know his grandson, or at least heard of his grandson. His grandson was William Clinton Story. William Clinton Story is the namesake of our American Legion here at Freeport. Bergen died at the age of 87, and he is buried in Greenfield Cemetery. When he died, it was reported his estate was worth over $500,000, which, if I did my calculations correctly, that is something like $16 million today. Okay, here we have George Wallace. He served as the 3rd president, or mayor, because mayors were referred to as presidents early on, of Freeport. Wallace is credited with selecting the name Nassau for Nassau County. Freeport, like many communities in Nassau County, was part of Queens County until 1898, when Queens County joined with other boroughs to become the city of Greater New York. 1899 was the year Nassau County officially began. Wallace was born in Elora, Canada, and came to Hempstead as a youth. He worked as a teacher in Lawrence, Rockville Centre, and Freeport. He received his law degree from New York University. In addition to being mayor of Freeport, he was a state assemblyman and served 8 years as justice of the peace for the town of Hempstead. Wallace established the newspaper Southside Observer in 1869. He assisted in organizing the Freeport Fire Department and served as the first foreman of Hose Company No. 1. Wallace lived at 80 South Ocean Avenue, and the house is pictured there. Today, that house is still standing. It's located at 249 South Ocean, and he named his house Elora after the town in which he was born in Canada. This is the J.H. Lant directory from 1894. This particular directory is owned by the Freeport Historical Society. It costs $2 in 1894, which roughly is about $60 today. It was published 2 years after Freeport was incorporated. Okay, featured in this directory is Charles Chip T. Baldwin, who was born in 1858. Baldwin was the first engineer of the Wide Awake Engine Company and an honorary deputy chief of the Freeport Fire Department. Baldwin was born in a toll house that was located near Merrick Road and South Long Beach Avenue, kind of where CVS is today on Merrick Road. His father, Thomas Baldwin, was a toll collector for the American Jamaica Plank Road Company that installed a wooden road from Jamaica all the way out to Merrick. During the Civil War, Baldwin's mother is said to have made pants for Union soldiers, and Baldwin claimed that his mother had the first Singer sewing machine in Freeport. The family moved out of the toll house in 1864 after the death of his father. Baldwin worked as a municipal gardener for the village of Freeport. He and his wife Minnie lived on Brookside Avenue and later 42 Morton Avenue. Baldwin died in the State Fireman's Home in Hudson, New York, and he too is buried in Greenfield Cemetery. William Foreman. William Foreman was born in 1847. He was the owner of the William Foreman Lumber Yard in Freeport. Foreman was born in England, emigrated to Canada with his parents. He came to the United States in 1871 and taught school in Merrick, Freeport, and Hempstead. Foreman entered the firm of Carman and Rayner, which sold lumber in 1891. And you can see from the Sanborn map to the right that the original lumber yard was located along the Freeport River. And the ad that you see from the 1894 directory is showing their new location was up near the railroad station. Foreman was a member of the Presbyterian Church. He served as a trustee, elder, and superintendent of Sunday schools. Foreman was a member of the Excelsior Hook and Ladder Company, the Union League, the Hempstead Bay Yacht Club, the Freeport Bicycle Club, vice president of the Freeport Bank, director of the Freeport Land Company, and president of the Board of Education. He married Jenny Hewlett in 1873, and both are buried in Greenfield Cemetery. And you're probably more familiar with his son, C. Milton Foreman, who took over the business of the lumber company. And on October 17th, 1953, 6 storage sheds at the lumber yard caught fire. And these sheds were located on North Main Street and Broadway. And the fire ended up causing $75,000 in damages. And I heard that you could see this fire as far away as Oceanside. Okay, this is the Isaac Horsfell's mill. Isaac Horsfell was born in 1834. He operated a grist mill and flour and sawmill in Freeport. He was born in England and settled in Freeport and established a successful mill on the Freeport Creek, otherwise known as the Freeport River. He later sold the pond to the Brooklyn City Water Department, and the mill was demolished. He built a new mill on Henry Street and operated until about 1899. He later moved to Potomac, Long Island. We do have a picture of him, but we do have a picture of his wife, Mary. To the right, you're going to see the pond that fed the mill. That today is the site of the Freeport Recreation Department. That is their parking lot. And sometimes you get those robocalls that tell you to move your car to higher ground. Don't park there because it's built on water. All right. And above that is a sandboard map of Isaac Horsfell's gristmill on Henry Street. Okay, now we're going to see another Lant directory from 1901 to 1902. Again, this one is owned by the Freeport Historical Society. This costs $2, and that's roughly about $61 in today's money. Here's an ad for George O. Baker, who was born around 1829. He was a Freeport sailmaker who maintained a sail loft on South Main Street. Very little is known about his early life, except that he was born in New York City and was a Civil War veteran. Baker established his sailmaking company in 1861 in the city. And around 1896, he moved his business to Freeport. Baker's sail loft was often used as a gathering place for fishermen and baymen. In 1899, oyster planters met in the loft to discuss how to keep New York City from diverting fresh water from the oyster beds. This was a big issue. Freeport had a very lucrative oyster industry, but oysters also need fresh water. And the city of Brooklyn was pumping that water into Brooklyn and making the waters here in Freeport much more salty. And so it actually killed our oyster industry. In 1912, fishermen organized at Baker's sail loft to fight a law that prohibited net fishing west of Seaford. Basically, the law was going to go after commercial fishermen. And they were only going to allow sports fishermen west of Seaford, and obviously that didn't go anywhere. Baker seemed to be well liked in Freeport. On Christmas Day, 1903, his friends threw a party for him that included speeches, a floral arrangement, and a signed certificate signed by all his friends. In 1905, Baker traveled to Pensacola, Florida to work as a foreman of a group that made sails for the U.S. government. Baker was described as a staunch Democrat who was politically active in the party. He was an honorary member of Hose 1, and he died of pneumonia at the age of 88. And once again, was very This is the H.L. Lant directory from 1907. This is courtesy of Al Veloci, who lent us the directory just so we could scan the Freeport section of it. And I'm pointing out here James Whaley. Whaley and his family were longtime residents of Freeport, and many of them worked the bays. Obviously, Whaley Street is named for the Whaley family. And there's a picture of Mr. Whaley outside his home. That house is located at 380 South Main Street near Atlantic Avenue. That house is still here today. And that is a picture of it as it looks today. The house was built in 1788. And an interesting thing about the picture of Mr. Whaley is he's sitting next to a hitching post. So that's where you would hitch your horse to. He had a farm that extended west, and the farm was divided by a small road that was known as Whaley's Lane, and that road later became Atlantic Avenue. Here we have H.P. Libby, and another person who was very instrumental in the South Shore Telephone Company. Libby was a prominent Freeport businessman who was involved in real estate and insurance. In 1892, he served on the committee to facilitate the incorporation of the Freeport. He was born in Maine. He was educated in Bridgeport, Connecticut. At the age of 17, Libby worked as a teacher while he was also employed by the Howe Sewing Machine Company. In the early 1870s, Libby relocated to Freeport and worked as a teacher in the Freeport schools. He served as principal from 1877 to 1880. For a year afterwards, Libby worked in the clothing industry Then he was employed by the Phoenix Insurance Company in New York City for 7 years. He helped establish the Freeport Bank, and he was involved in the creation of the Freeport Land Company, in which he held the position of secretary. Libby had an office on Railroad Avenue opposite the Long Island Railroad Depot. And as I mentioned before, he also served as president of the South Shore Telephone Company. He was also on the board of the Board of Education and was trustee of the Freeport Public Library, which is now the Freeport Memorial Library. And he was also very involved in the Presbyterian Church. And that is a picture of Libby's house on South Ocean Avenue. And sadly, that house is no longer here today. Okay, this is a listing for Dr. Rosenthal. He is not a Freeport, but there is a Freeport connection here. About a year or so ago, I was approached by an author who was writing the history of synagogues on Long Island, and he wanted to use this picture in his book. And it turns out that on November 28, 1897, the first worship service for the Hebrew Reunion were held at the offices of Dr. Rosenthal at 50 Main Street in Hempstead. But there is a Freeport connection here. Freeporter Morris Miller was a member of the Hebrew Union and most likely was in attendance at that service. And Miller went on to be very instrumental in the founding of B'nai Israel. And he is identified in the cornerstone laying of B'nai as the oldest congregant of the synagogue. This is the Polk directory for 1930-31. This directory is owned by the Freeport Historical Society. And here we feature Samuel Rock Smith. Smith was born in 1862, was a prominent businessman and civic leader in Freeport. He was born in Merrick to Carmen and Ruthella Smith. He was educated at the Freeport Academy, which was a local private school. He also attended the Rockville Center Institute and New York University. He began his career working for a newspaper, the South Shore Observer, in Rockville Center. At the age of 20, he went to North Dakota, where he started a store and later a bank. After returning to Long Island, he founded the East Rockaway Bank in 1888, which eventually became the Bank of Long Island. His home was built on property on Smith Street that extended from Guy Lombardo Avenue to Ocean Avenue, which was a pretty large piece of property. And you can see that there in the pictures. I mean, it had tennis courts and such. Smith was an outspoken opponent of trolleys in Freeport, another thing that everybody thinks everyone loved, but in fact everyone hated. And when a crew came to lay some of the tracks for the trolley that was near his property, and they did so in the middle of the night, Smith was so outraged that he jumped into his car, drove to Jamaica to obtain a temporary injunction from Supreme Court Justice J.C. Van Seelen, and was able to return home at 4 a.m. to stop the construction. For many years, Smith served as president of the Freeport School Board and chairman of the Freeport Memorial Library Committee that helped raise funds that built our original library building. Smith was a member of the Methodist Church, the Spartan Lodge, Sons of the Revolution, and Hempstead Bay Yacht Club. Smith died in a Brooklyn hospital at the age of 69, and at the time of his death, his estate was also worth $500,000. And in 1931 dollars, again, if I did my calculations correctly, that was worth about $9 million. Here we have Roland Manchester Lamb, who was born in 1878. He was the 11th president or mayor of Freeport. He also served as police chief while mayor. Lamb was born in Massachusetts and graduated from Tufts College in 1900. While in Freeport, he became an early real estate developer. Lamb once was the proprietor of the Manhattan House, which was a hotel and tavern. His real estate business, Pettit and Lamb, was located on South Main Street, next door to the Manhattan House. In 1912, Lamb partnered with Thomas Forbes and Frank Wentworth to organize the Freeport Railroad Company and the Great South Bay Ferry Company. Later, he headed the Lamb and Jensen Dredging Company. Lamb and his wife Eleanor lived at 43 Onslow Place. He was a member of the Freeport Elks Club, the Ready Relief Society, the Freeport Council, Junior Order of United American Mechanics, and the Freeport Lodge of Independent Order of Odd Fellows. Sadly, Lamb died early at the age of 57 at the Meadowbrook Hospital following a stroke. Okay. Here we see members of the Jarvis family. The Jarvis family is the first documented African-American family in the village of Freeport, and the patriarch of that family was Moses Jarvis. The Moses Jarvis listed there is his son, and Henrietta was Moses Jarvis's wife. Moses Jarvis was born sometime around 1852. He was a member of the first documented African-American families in Freeport. He grew up in Hempstead, though, and he did lose a leg in his youth. And depending on what source you read, it was either that it was the result of an amputation from a fall, or he had an accident involving the Long Island Railroad. Moses built a successful scavenger business that thrived until the 1930s when municipal sewers went into service. He also engaged in the private collection of garbage and ashes. In his business, Jarvis employed both whites and African Americans. It was said that Jarvis once paid $650 for a team of horses for his wagons, which he then leased to local funeral directors to pull hearses. For a time, the Jarvis family lived in Merrick, but later moved to Sweezy Avenue. And in 1915, the Jarvis family had a telephone. This is Eloji Seken. He was born in 1880 in Japan, and he was a business owner who lived at 312 Locust Avenue. He first came to the United States around 1906 and started a toothbrush import business in New York City. He lived in Freeport with his British-born wife, Constance, her father, Frederick Beer, his nephew, Hidoti, and sister-in-law, Cherry Blossom Goda. In 1928, Sakane established a factory in Baltimore, which made toothbrushes. In December 1941, after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, the government closed the factory in Baltimore for several weeks in order to investigate the company. That Christmas, Sakane insisted that all his 150 workers get paid for the time that the factory was closed. The factory was reopened and enlarged for wartime operations. Unfortunately, Sakane was arrested in Freeport and incarcerated for a period of time at Fort Meade as part of the government-sponsored wartime internment of Japanese Americans. After his release in 1944, he presented the Freeport Red Cross with a station wagon. The following year, he presented Freeport High School with two 1,000 scholarships who were given to two deserving students. Sakane also received patents for various styles of toothbrushes in 1936 and 38, respectively. And sadly, he died in 1949 at the age of 70. Okay, Glickman Studios was located at 37 West Merrick Road. It was owned by Samuel Glickman. The photography studio was opened in 1918 and was originally located at 13 Railroad Avenue. Later, the Glickman studio was moved to 31 South Grove Street, now Guy Lombardo Avenue. This location once was occupied by another notable photographer, Jacob D. Kiefer, and we have a lot of photos at the Historical Society from Kiefer. Between 1949 and 1950, Glickman Studio relocated to this location at 37 West Merrick Road. And according to a 1984 Leader article, Samuel Glickman learned his trade as an apprentice in Germany and was the official photographer of the Tsar's Russian army in 1905. I have not been able to prove that, so I don't know if it's true, but it does make for a great story, so I'm including it. Glickman worked for the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, and he was known for his ability to retouch faded and damaged photographs. And sadly, the Glickman studio went out of business in 2009. This is an ad for the Joseph P.M. Anderson's company, the Anderson Employment Agency. Anderson was born in 1862 in Pennsylvania. He was the owner and proprietor of the Anderson Employment Agency, which was located at 12 Waverly Place in Freeport's Bennington Park. His wife Cecile owned the Cecile Beauty Parlor at 16 Helen Avenue. And this is why these directories are so important to us. Because there's a tendency when we look at history, we always look at sort of the great man, great event history. And there's not a lot that covers the everyman story, right? Or as some people would call it, the history from below. What I do know about Anderson is that he was African-American. He lived in Bennington Park, and that area of Freeport was established in 1902. And beginning in 1916, at the start of the Great Migration, where many African-Americans came north, many of them settled in what became Bennington Park, which became an African-American and Italian enclave. And in the 1920s, Bennington Park had a bit of a renaissance. They published their own newspaper. Many of its residents were politically and civically active, and we see the rise of entrepreneurship. And Freeport in the 20s was the Hamptons before the Hamptons, okay? So many prominent and wealthy New Yorkers summered here in Freeport. So they had these grand homes and estates, and Anderson helped supply them with help because there was a need for domestics. They needed maids, cooks, gardeners, and chauffeurs. And Anderson served as a bridge between the white and black community. Now, the one thing about this ad, it is not a one-off ad in this directory. This ad appears throughout this 3031 directory. So it shows that even at the beginning of the Depression, Anderson had some success because he could afford to advertise his business. Here is the Montauk Business Directory from 1913. This directory is also owned by the Freeport Historical Society. And one of the companies here that many Freeporters will recognize is the Columbian Bronze Company, which was originally known as the Columbian Brass Foundry. This business began as a brass foundry in 1871 in Brooklyn. The plant was moved to Freeport in 1905 and was located originally on Atlantic Avenue near the bridge to Baldwin. In 1908, the company was incorporated. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Columbian Bronze, they made propellers for ships. And to test their propellers, they used to have a mile course off Long Creek. In 1911, ground was broken for an $18,000 factory located on North Main Street, just south of Seaman Avenue. The following year, the building was opened and managed the Columbian Garage for automobile repairs. And the garage's motto was "Good work for a square deal." In 1916, the Columbian Brass became Columbian Bronze, and the company was reported to have $450,000 in capital. The company was best known for making marine propellers, which ranged in size from a few inches to 10 feet in diameter. And Columbian Bronze's slogan was, "With a Columbian propeller behind you, you always come out ahead in the end." And this was painted on the side of their building, and you can see it there. Due to the large number of orders from the U.S. Army and Navy during World War II, the Columbian Bronze opened a second factory on Brooklyn Avenue in 1943. This location was known as Plant 2 and was formerly the location of Croft Motors. It employed 60 employees, many of whom were women, and this factory operated 23 hours a day, and starting pay was 55 cents for women, 60 cents for men. The Nautilus, the world's first nuclear power submarine, had propellers shaped by Columbian Bronze. It was also said that Jacques Cousteau's ship, the Calypso, had Columbian Bronze wheels. Columbian Bronze was eventually became a subsidiary of Ferguson Propellers, Inc. in Hoboken, New Jersey, and the factory closed in 1988. Also mentioned in the Montauk directory is the company of Lewis Haynes Ross. Ross was a local businessman who spent 35 years living in Freeport. He was born in Maine and came to Long Island and ran a lumber yard in Baldwin. Later became a business partner of John J. Randall in a lumber and coal company known as Ross and Randall. Ross and his wife Carrie were very active in the Methodist Church, and Ross was also a member of the Freeport Board of Education and director of the Freeport Club in 1900. Ross and his wife Carrie had 3 children, and they lived at 188 Archer Street, and that is a picture of their house on Archer Street. That house is still there today. It looks a little different, but it is still there. And lucky for us, the Ross family seemed to be very into photography, so a lot of the glass negatives that we have in our collection at the Freeport Historical Society come from the Ross family. And one of the more interesting photos is an early class photo of the Freeport Public Schools. And so we have sort of the only known existence of photographs from inside that earlier school that later burned down. Okay, so here's some information that most people probably don't know. Betty Gordinier founded the Yellow Book in 1931. Gordinier was born in Chicago. She was one of 5 children. She worked in real estate, but decided to try something new when the markets crashed in 1929. And her company, Merchant Advertising Services, Inc., its first Yellow Book was published in 1931, and it had 60 pages. And what her phone book was more than just a straight directory of people, addresses, and phone numbers. It included a business directory, a bus schedule, a tax calendar, a directory of village officials, listings of school, churches, and other civic organizations. So it was very comprehensive. It was almost like an almanac. In 1941, the Yellow Book was published in 5 editions, covering the South Shore from Valley Stream to Montauk, and also included the township of Huntington. Merchants Advertising Service employed 7 to 12 people and produced a telephone book that averaged 300 pages. And we do have a copy of the 1939-1940 Yellow Book. This copy is courtesy of Brian Merlis, who owns the original. And I'm going to point out 2 people from this book. The first one is Alonzo Webster Myers, who was born in 1884 in Orangeburg, South Carolina, and he came to Freeport around 1908. He settled in Bennington Park. He and his wife Josephine lived at 49 Bennington Avenue. Myers worked as a steward in the Freeport Club. In 1912, he started the Myers Messenger Service, which operated between Freeport and New York City. He was also a general contractor specializing in chimney and kitchen ventilation, and later he was employed by the town of Hempstead as a custodian at Town Hall, a position that he held for 20 years. Myers founded and served as president of the Trojan Civic League, an association of men and women who supported the moral, civic, and political advancement of the African American community. In 1946, Myers served as vice chairman for fundraising for the Freeport Salvation Army. He was also a member of the Freeport Republican Club. Myers' mother, Sarah Myers, had been born into slavery in South Carolina in 1835. Her father was also her owner. She lived in Freeport with her son for 20 years, dying at the age of 93. At the time of her death in 1928, the newspapers reported that she was the last Freeporter to have been born into slavery in Freeport. So basically, in one generation, the Myers family goes from being property to owning property. Alonzo Myers was quite successful. He owned his own home, he owned a car, and had a telephone. And he was an entrepreneur. And he also eventually became a civil servant, and probably had a pretty good pension if he worked there for 20 years. And he had the one thing that all Americans strived for and still want today. He had leisure time because he was involved in so many different organizations. Myers died at his home at the age of 71, and he is buried in Evergreen Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. The other gentleman I'd like to highlight is Henry Washington Toomer, who was born in 1895, was also a longtime resident of Bennington Park. Toomer was born in Charleston, South Carolina. Around 1914, Toomer and his father worked for Lewis H. Ross. Toomer later enlisted in the 15th New York Infantry National Guard for service along the Mexican border, but was soon mustered into active service for the 369th U.S. Army Infantry at the outbreak of World War I. While serving in France as a corporal, it was reported that Toomer had been gassed. He returned home in 1919. Toomer worked for the Postal Service in New York City. He was a member of the Henry Morrison Deloney Post American Legion, the Sunset Lodge of Elks, the Southeast Civic Association, and at the time of his death in 1961, Toomer was one of two remaining Freeport veterans of the original 369th Regiment. And if you're not familiar with the 369th, they were known as the Harlem Hellfires. It was an all-black regiment. Toomer was also very, very involved in Bethel AME Church. Okay, so I'm going to use this as an example of the limitations of the phone book. As the phone books progress, the only people that get listed in the phone book are people with phones. Okay, so there's not always an accurate listing of everybody in that community. And this is a case in point. A number of years ago, a gentleman from Ireland, a researcher from Ireland, contacted me. He actually came to America. He was researching a plane crash that occurred in 1952. It was an Aer Lingus flight that crashed into a mountain in Wales, killing all 23 people on board. And this researcher lived in the same town as the pilot, and he had been sort of obsessed with this crash and decided he was going to write a book about this crash and write the bios of all those that were lost. There were only two Americans on the plane, a gentleman from Long Beach and a Freeporter named William A. Lynch. Very quickly, I learned that it was very hard to get information on William Lynch. We know that he lived at 118 Center Street. The family did not have a phone, and you can see that they're missing from that directory. Lynch, at the time of his death, was an engineer and atomic scientist for Los Alamos laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. He had been born in Brooklyn, and his family moved and resided at 118 Center Street. He attended Our Holy Redeemer School and graduated from Freeport High School in 1939. And this is what I thought was interesting. The guy is working as an atomic scientist. He's basically an atom splitter. So I'm thinking he's probably really smart. But according to his yearbook, he wasn't involved in any clubs. He wasn't like valedictorian or salutatorian. He wouldn't win any prizes. So I thought maybe he graduated early or something. So I called over to the Freeport schools and I just said, like, did this guy graduate, or maybe he graduated early? Like, what's the deal with him? And they checked and they said, no, Lynch did graduate in 1939. And he was a mediocre student. And then they looked a little into his records and they said, here's something odd. He blew away all his finals, and every standardized test he took, he aced it. And there was a note in his record that he scored like Ubermensch genius on an intelligence test. So this guy was really, really smart. He was probably just bored in school. That's why he was sort of mediocre. After he graduated Freeport High School, he got his bachelor's degree in chemical engineering from Pratt Institute. And he originally worked for the Firestone Tire and Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio. And at World War II, the Defense Department grabbed him and said, we need you to work with us. So while working at Los Alamos, he had planned a 2-week European vacation. He had a lot of relatives living in Ireland at the time. His parents were actually born there. And to prepare for his trip, it was reported that he took an 8-week correspondence class to learn French. And when on his way from traveling from the continent to Ireland, he got on that Aer Lingus flight known as the St. Kevin, and then it crashed. And I just find it so odd. And I'm not saying anything nefarious happened, but you have an atomic scientist roaming around Europe at the height of the Cold War. I don't know. It just seems a little weird. Okay. This is the directory that was published by Newsday. It looks like they got into the phone directory business. This particular directory is owned by the Freeport Memorial Library. And I have actually scanned this directory, but it is not available online yet, not because I'm putting an embargo on it. It's 43 years old. The reason why I haven't put it up yet, it's just so big. The libguide doesn't support that kind of size file. So eventually I'm going to migrate somewhere else and I'll just have a link to it. This directory includes a history of the communities, local government numbers, and places of interest. So one of the things it has in here is the history, information about the Freeport Recreation Department. So the Freeport Recreation Center is also known as the Freeport Community Center and was once referred to as the Hance Park Community Center. It is located at 130 East Merrick Road in a building named the Rayner Rock Smith Building. It was dedicated in 1974, and the Recreation Center opened to the public in 1975. It sits on 13 acres that were originally part of Horsfell's Pond and later called Hance Park. The building cost $6 million to construct. In 1975, the facility included a swimming pool, a steam and sauna bath, an exercise room, a gymnasium, dining areas, a game room, a playground, bocce and handball courts, a skating rink that was converted into a miniature golf course in the summer season. And in 1975, membership for a Freeport resident was $2 a year. In 2009, the village held a ceremony to honor former Mayor Robert J. Sweeney. Since the Freeport Recreation Center was the vision of Mayor Sweeney during his term in office, a plaque in his honor was unveiled at the ceremony. And the plaque hangs today at the front entrance of the Freeport Rec Center. What people currently refer to as the Rec was not Freeport's first effort in recreation facilities. Though talk of creating a recreation center in Freeport began around 1912, Freeport's first successful recreation center came to fruition on January 10th, 1965, with the creation of a youth center. This facility was located at 61 Pine Street and was part of the Freeport schools. It had 5 rooms. A center had a jukebox, a television, 2 game rooms, an art room, a lounge, and an all-purpose room. And it was open Monday through Saturday. This center was the product of combined efforts of the Freeport Parks Commission, the Mayor's Committee for Youth, Freeport's Council of Youth, the Board of Education, and team volunteers participated in painting and decorating the facility. One of the ads in the book is for Nichols Rug Cleaning, which was founded in 1923 by Walter M. Nichols. And their storefront was located at 86 East Sunrise Highway. In addition to rug cleaning, Nichols also offered rug storage. In 1954, the business was run by Nichols' daughter, Madeline, and her husband, Howard W. Lawrence. In 1947, Howard opened the Lawrence Rug and Furniture Cleaning and Patching.
Library patrons are limited to 1 visit daily.
Wait for the announcement to end.
And masks must be worn properly at all times.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, so Howard opened the Lawrence Rug and Furniture Cleaners in Patchogue. His son Wade later took over the Freeport business, and in 1972, he added a retail carpet department. Walter Nichols served as trustee of the village of Freeport during the Robert Patterson administration. That building is still around. It is now New York Shower Door on Sunrise Highway. Here are just 2 random people that I thought were of some interest. They are not related. The first one is Arthur Kay, who lived at 15 Hampton Place. In the 1970s, Arthur Kay had a leak in his basement that ruined part of his parquet floor. That really upset him. So in effort to improve the drainage around his house, he was laying a pipe to a dry well when he realized he kept uncovering all these artifacts buried in his backyard. Well, one of the things he found was 472 antique bottles. His property was an old garbage dump, and the oldest bottle he found was from 1874. So it was probably worth something. Remember, there was no municipal garbage service until the 1930s. So people burned their garbage, they dumped their ashes, and other parts of their garbage, they would just go to an empty lot and bury it. The other K listed is Irving K. He lived at 14 Oakfield Avenue, and he was involved with the Amateur Fencers League. And you're probably not familiar with him, but you probably do know his brother. Mel Brooks. The Mel Brooks and his brother Irving, their last name was Kaminsky. And the other notable person that lived on Oakfield Avenue was Lou Reed. And this is a 1989 directory. It's actually a reverse directory, and it is owned by the Freeport Memorial Library. And it's only 31 years old, so I don't feel comfortable actually making this one available online, just because there's a lot of people in there still alive, and since it's a reverse directory, it would be a listing of you and all your neighbors and their phone numbers. So I do have it. If somebody wanted to come in and look at it, they just need to call me and make an appointment. I'm going to include some of the interesting people that were listed there. This particular directory lists phone numbers and customers by exchanges, customers by streets, and also has a really interesting list of exchanges by town. And it also includes a zip code directory. The first person, so again, it's listed by address. So the first person I'm doing, it was the Reverend Dr. Millett, who lived on Forest Avenue. He was born in 1834. He was pastor of the Greater Second Baptist Church, which is located at 129 East Merrick Road in Bennington Park. He was born in Georgia. Millett was called to the gospel ministry at the age of 12 and was ordained at the age of 16. And he was the youngest minister in the state of Georgia. When he was 17, he was invited to preach at the Shiloh Baptist Church in Rockville Center. The pastor of Shiloh would later recommend Millett to the Baptist congregation in Freeport. He was the fourth pastor of this church, and under his leadership, the word greater was added to the church's name. Mallett's first pastorship was the Little First African Baptist Church in Woodville, Georgia, a suburb of Savannah. He received his bachelor's degree from New York University and his doctorate in theology from Sacred Heart in England. Millett was a commissioner for the Freeport Housing Authority, where he served for 15 years, and he later served as the commission's chairman. He was a member of the Village Ethics Commission and the Dr. E. Millett, Mitchell Millett Senior Citizen Apartments on North Main Street were named in his honor. He was known for singing of gospel music, and he released a gospel album entitled Use God's Might. In the country of Liberia, Millett was made an African chief and was named bishop in the Light of the World Interdenominational International Association. Sadly, Millett died at the age of 64 in 1998. Okay, Otto's Seagram, located at 271 Woodcleft Avenue. Otto's is the oldest restaurant on the Nautical Mile and possibly the oldest in Freeport. It was opened in 1929 by Otto Coughlin and his wife Helen. Coughlin came to the United States from Germany in the 1920s and worked in New York City as a waiter before opening Otto's. The couple and their daughter Barbara lived in an apartment above the restaurant. In 1939, Otto's added a new addition to accommodate larger parties, and the restaurant was entirely redecorated. Barbara Coughlin, who just recently died in 2020, was a lifelong Freeporter who graduated Freeport High School in 1950. She was also a member of the Freeport Chamber of Commerce, the Nautical Mile Merchants Association, and a founding member of the Freeport Festival. Coughlin married Arnhem Jagnow, a native of Hanover, Germany, in 1955. Their daughter Alona is now the third generation to run this iconic Freeport restaurant. In 2012, during Superstorm Sandy, 5.5 feet of water destroyed Otto's kitchen and dining room. In less than a year, though, this iconic restaurant was open for business. And finally, we're going to talk about Anna Filey, who was born in 1907, who was the owner of Atlantic Nursery and Garden Shop. Born near Stuttgart in Germany, she came to the United States in 1929. That same year, her brother Carl, who had come to America 2 years prior, started a gardening and maintenance business called Atlantic Avenue Nursery. Filey joined the business in 1940. In 1953, her brother Paul developed the landscaping side of the business when Carl died suddenly of a heart attack in 1957. Filey took over the nursery. In the 1960s, the business changed its name to Atlantic Nursery and Garden Shop. The landscape construction division separated from the retail side of the nursery to become Atlantic Landscape Design Associates, Inc. In 1968, Filey was the first woman voted Nurseryman of the Year by the Long Island Nurserymen's Association. She became head of the association in 1977. 4 years later, she was inducted into the New York State Nursery and Landscape Association Hall of Fame. An endowment was established in her name with the New York State Nurserymen's Foundation in 1988. On her 90th birthday, Suning Farmingdale presented her with its Ram's Horn Award. Filey is featured in the book Gardening on Long Island with Irene Barrage. She died in 1998 and is buried in Holyrood Cemetery in Westbury. And that is the program. And you can see here you have my email address, and if you want to access those directories, I put a tiny URL so you can get there directly. And let's turn that off. And there I am. Does anybody have any questions, or just open your mic up, or just put some questions into the chat? And Jose, if there's anything any questions you want me to read, you want to read to me?
Regina,
Yeah.
thank you.
No problem.
That was absolutely amazing and so well done.
Oh, thanks.
All right. Okay, nighty night.
Nighty night.
Take
Patricia,
care.
yeah.
Thank
Patricia
you.
asked you,
Yeah, you're very welcome.
Good.
is the book about Aer Lingus Crash Shamrock 165 by Gavin Walsh?
Yes.
And you're getting a lot of compliments. Good job.
Okay.
So much fun. Great job.
Nope, nothing about my pineapple. I got a great pineapple.
I saw that.
Yeah, it's from Room Raiders, man. Look, I got my book. I got my power broker. You know, come on.
Is this your workspace?
No, this is just an office in the library.
Okay.
I just customized it.
Well, it looks lovely. All right. Good night, all.
Good night.
Nice to see you. Thank you. That was great.
Thank you.
Talk to you
Rita.
soon. See you soon.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Anybody else? Other questions? Anything? All right. If not, guys, you know where I work.
Where do you work?
I've never seen you before.
Thanks, Regina. I really enjoyed
I
it.
actually have makeup on. I haven't had makeup on since March.
I'm going to stop recording it, actually.
Okay, stop recording.
All right.